Unitarian Universalist history is filled with rebels and heretics. These heretics were folks who had different ideas about life and love and God. These rebels were women, LGBTQ folks, and Black, Indigenous people of color, who were determined to do things that their era and their community did not permit. Our religious ancestors and fellow Unitarian Universalists today rejected the way things were, squabbled with the status quo, resisted unquestioned authority, and worked to make the world a better place, not for themselves alone, but for each and every one of us. But before we pat ourselves on the back, it is important to note that there have been many in our ranks, both lay people and ministers, who have not been rebels or heretics. These are the folks who hoped that the issue of slavery would just take care of itself someday. These are the folks who invited their ministers to leave the congregation when their ministers spoke up against things that are on the other side of contentious issues. These are the folks who may benefit from the way things are now and are not too concerned with what happens to others. And the gift and challenge of Unitarian Universalism is that we get to choose. Will we choose to be like the rebels and travel the path towards equity and justice for all? Or will we choose to serve ourselves alone? Today, we focus on the rebels and heretics with the hope that they will give us inspiration. We begin with Arius. Arius was not a Unitarian or a Universalist, but he can be a reminder that there have always been people questioning the dominant culture, including the teachings of Christianity. Arius lived from about the year 256 to 336 CE in Alexandria, Egypt. Reconstructing Arius' life and his ideas is a difficult task. None of his original writings survive. Everything we know about Arius comes to us through his opponents, who denounced him as a heretic. Arius taught the supremacy and uniqueness of God the Father above and beyond the Son. Arius believed that the Father God is infinite, eternal, and almighty. Arius thought that God the Father's divinity was greater than Jesus' divinity. He also believed that Jesus had a beginning and was born into existence, while God already was and had been. In Arius' mind, this meant that God and Jesus were not the same. The best way that I can make sense of this esoteric concern is to translate it into modern math. God the parent is 100% divine, and God the child is something like 43% divine. This nuance in theology may not seem like a big deal today in our lives, and honestly, I'm not sure it was a big deal back then either. But what was a big deal was that the Roman Empire had a vested interest in solidifying power. One way that the empire accomplished this was to squash out any and all divergent ideas and theologies. Before the big meeting in Nicaea in 325 CE, there had been several competing theologies. But once the official Nicene Creed was developed and implemented, all divergent theologies went underground, and any records were destroyed. The early Unitarians were often taunted with the dismissive insult Arian, spelled A-R-I-A-N, meaning those who follow the heretical teachings of Arius. Early Unitarians were not concerned with Arius' teachings, but because our theologies diverged from the dominant culture, opponents of the new ideas looked to undermine any support that Unitarians were coalescing by mocking us as heretics. Our opponents were not successful, as we seem to like to be heretics. Now, let us zoom forward in time to the mid-1800s, to the moment that Olympia Brown held a thick envelope in her hands from St. Lawrence Seminary. She had already received contrived rejections from the Unitarian Seminary, Meadville, and from Oberlin. According to Stephen Kendrick in his book, A Faith People Make, a dramatization of Unitarian Universalists in history, Olympia's hands shook as she tore open the envelope. Her options were down to this one letter. The answer? Yes. she could come and be treated like any other student. However, the president of St. Lawrence, Dr. Ebenezer Fisher, made it clear that he did not feel that women should be a minister. But, he wrote Olympia, I leave that between you and the great head of the church. Olympia clutched the letter and laughed in relief, exclaiming, that is just where the decision should be. Some months later, Olympia Brown, surrounded by her bags and books, exclaimed to the church proctor, what do you mean I'm not expected? There's no Miss Brown listed. You can read for yourself. Not accepting another roadblock to her plans, Olympia responded, this is outrageous. Please have the president check his records. Dr. Fisher was called. When he arrived, he looked mildly at the angry young woman. Ah, yes, Miss Brown. I had supposed you would be discouraged by my letter and refrain from such a long journey. Olympia Brown responded, your discouragement was my encouragement. No, sir, I am just beginning my journey. There were 15 men in her seminary class. The men hardly knew what to do with a woman in their midst. Some ignored her. 2 yapped under her window at night, imitating her grating and shrill voice. Unfortunately, most of her classmates were harsh and unbending. The mildest comment that they would make was, well, it was very good, but I would hardly call it a sermon. However, even with all of this taunting by her classmates, the local congregations wanted to hear her preach and did. After 2 years, one congregation offered to speak upon her behalf. The congregation vouched for Olympia. Olympia spoke passionately about her call and skills for ministry. And about an hour later, Dr. Fisher approached her, his face solemn. Ms. Brown, he said, against my better judgment, I'm afraid the council wishes to ordain you into the Universalist ministry. And then he smiled and added, and I shall participate. I know that ministry is not for a woman, but I know courage when I see it. If congregations want to hear you, then they shall hear you as a minister of God in full standing. 60 years later, the Reverend Olympia Brown reflected on that moment. It was the first time that Universalists, or any denomination, had formally ordained a woman as a preacher. She continued, they took that stand, a remarkable day in history, which shows the courage of those men. Stephen Kendrick, the author of the book that this story comes from, and I concur, and the determination of one woman. And now, let us turn our attention to the Reverend Dr. William R. Jones, someone who we would all do well to know more about. My colleague, the Reverend Dan Harper, offers a rather pointed description of Dr. Jones's impact, or lack thereof, on Unitarian Universalism. He writes, Dr. Williams Jones was the preeminent Unitarian Universalist humanist theologian of the past 50 years. Since he was one of the few Unitarian Universalist theologians to have a reputation beyond the denomination, he is also arguably one of the 3 or 4 most important Unitarian Universalist theologians of any persuasion in the last 50 years. Harper then offers this critique. Frustratingly, Jones is too little known within Unitarian Universalism. Instead of being considered as a central thinker, a moral touchstone to whom we can turn for deep insights into some of the most particular moral dilemmas of our time. A thinker who outlines one of the most compelling reasons for being a humanist, he is, in my experience, dismissed as somewhat marginal. Given this critique that Unitarian Universalists have dismissed Dr. Jones as a marginal influence in our faith, I invite him in as one of the rebels and heretics that we consider today. There is an aspect of theology which seeks to explain why suffering exists in the world and who and what is responsible for suffering. Does one place the responsibility for suffering on God? Or does one place the responsibility for suffering with humanity? In an article in the UU World, the Reverend Colin Boson offers 3 statements that help us clarify what we believe about suffering. He writes, "If you assign responsibility for suffering to God, then you are most certainly a theist. If you see suffering as redemptive in a cosmic sense, then chances are you are some type of Christian." And then he goes on, "Most humanists reject these views and place the responsibility for suffering squarely in the human realm." In his book, Is God a White Racist?, Dr. William Jones offers an alternative to well-known Black Christian theologians such as James Cone. These theologians saw God as a redeeming force in the face of centuries of Black oppression. In opposition to this, Jones proposes that suffering is not redemptive. Jones argues that understanding suffering as redemptive makes the oppressed complicit in their own oppression. Jones proposed that human beings must take responsibility for addressing suffering because so much suffering is caused by humanity. He felt that humanity could bring about change that would lessen suffering. Jones's ideas led to the development of a distinct Black humanism, grounded in the Black experience of living under white supremacy culture in America. Black humanism speaks to the particular types of suffering that oppressed people experience. Dr. Anthony Pinn, a student of William Jones, offers 5 basic principles of Black humanism. These principles are: 1. Understanding humanity as fully responsible for the human condition and the correction of humanity's plight. 2. Suspicion toward or rejection of supernatural explanation and claims. 3. An appreciation for African American cultural production and a perception of traditional forms of Black religiosity as having cultural importance as opposed to any type of cosmic authority. 4. A commitment to individual and societal transformation. And then 5. A controlled optimism that recognizes both human potential and human destructive activities. Our Unitarian Universalist faith encompasses many divergent and convergent ideas, theologies, and ways of being. Our faith was built and developed over the centuries by people working for what they believed to be true and ethically and moral right. Throughout time, people have turned to this faith for inspiration. Many have found this faith life-saving. One thing that has always been true for Unitarian Universalists is that we get to choose how we will respond to the life that unfolds in front of us. For some, that might mean teaching and developing new theologies. For some, it might be going up against unjust laws and cultural norms. And for some, it might mean rebuilding an institution that had become so caught up in rebellion that it had allowed its foundation to deteriorate. To close, I want to briefly introduce Robert West. Bob West was elected to the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association in the late 60s. The country was riled up with the civil rights movement and opposition to the Vietnam War. The UUA was staggering off of a near split when a majority of Black Unitarian Universalists and their white allies marched out of the General Assembly. Bob entered the UUA offices at 25 Beacon Street, knowing that there were financial deficits. He did not know how extreme those financial shortages were. Bob West had to make some very difficult choices, and they were highly contested. He fired staff. He consolidated programs. He refocused the UUA's responsibilities to the bare essentials. In a movement of anti-authoritarian rebels, heretics, and dare I say it, go-it-aloners, Bob had a different kind of rebel. Bob became a different kind of rebel. One who worked to maintain the institution and rebuild the structures that hold together the separate congregations of this faith. Without his efforts, and the efforts of a few others, we would likely not be here today as Unitarian Universalists. He too was a rebel. Are you?